You see that?
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right. Um, so hi everyone, my name is Mackenzie St. Arnault. I'm a master's student here at U of T, and I'm supervised by Dr. Farber, which you are all now very familiar with. And today I'll be presenting on what I've done on my thesis so far, titled Turning Preferences into Practice, Travel Mode Dissonance and Sustainable Mobility. Change the title a bit. But yeah, I'll just get right into some background. So travel mode dissonance refers to the mismatch between one's primary mode of travel and their preferred mode of travel. So, for example, if I drive to work every day, but I'd really prefer to cycle, I'd be considered dissonant. And the other side of that coin is travel mode consonance. So it's when your primary mode matches your preferred mode. Prior works find that dissonance is relatively common, ranging from 21% in Montreal to 50% in Ghent. And both of these studies primarily focus on travel satisfaction, and generally find that attitudes are most positive towards active modes and least positive towards public transit. In my thesis, I try to move away from travel satisfaction, and explore how dissonance shapes patterns of sustainable mobility. Conceptually, dissonance has two main key implications for sustainability. The first of which is that among dissonant drivers, dissonance can point to where the potential for mode shifts towards sustainable modes is greatest. This group is already inclined towards sustainable travel, but are just likely constrained by things like limited accessibility or poor service quality, which prevents them from adopting such alternatives. And then secondly, we have dissonant sustainable mode users. Um, this group points to where the risk of switching to car travel is the greatest. And they're especially likely to switch away from their sustainable modes if the conditions of those modes and their daily experiences don't improve. In both of these cases, understanding dissonance can be useful for designing targeted transportation interventions, either to enable shifts towards sustainable modes or help retain current users of sustainable modes. So these considerations culminate into my central research questions, which are what are the spatial, social, and modal patterns of travel mode dissonance within large Canadian cities? And what factors are associated with these patterns? To answer these questions, I draw on a conceptual framework that situates travel mode dissonance as arising from a combination of structural conditions and internal psychological factors. So, structural conditions include things like insufficient travel options, such as limited protected cycling infrastructure or maybe poor transit accessibility, and as well as the presence of travel barriers. So, things like a lack of car ownership or inflexible work schedules. And then psychological factors can be understood as firstly travel experiences. So these may capture like how individuals evaluate the quality of their day-to-day travel. So in terms of like perceived comfort or perceived safety or convenience. And then finally, underlying values, which reflect more stable orientations, such as environmental concern or cultural affinities towards using particular modes. In my research, I kind of hone in these ideas into three main umbrellas, the first of which are socioeconomic factors. So these structure the travel barriers that people face, and they realistically shape the modes that you can use, and the built environment, which dictates the availability of different travel modes more directly, and can pose additional travel barriers related to accessibility. And finally, travel perceptions, which reflect how well individuals' mobility experiences align with their needs and values, ultimately influencing what kinds of modes they choose to use. So we'll just get into some methods. For the bulk of my analysis, I use the NSTP, which is what this whole symposium is about. I also do use some cumulative opportunity accessibility measures uh, uh, created by Bren, a fellow researcher here at Mobilizing Justice. And I also use the Canadian Suburbs Atlas to classify urban form in my analysis. For my sample, I limit the study area to CMAs with populations over 300,000, and this resulted in over 16,000 observations across 17 cities. And also just a quick note, because I know this is going to come up, I define unsustainable modes as private motorized vehicles, which is created from a kind of larger list of modes captured in the NSTP. And I define sustainable modes as essentially anything else, so public transit, walking, and cycling and micromobility. So the first part of my analysis focuses on descriptive patterns of dissonance. So basically looking at how much dissonance there is and how it emerges across different modes, geographies, and populations. And then I move on to use multinomial logit regression models to estimate the likelihood of belonging to different dissonance categories, dependent on socioeconomic factors, the built environment, and travel perceptions. I'm going to explain this a little bit. I basically estimate four models, one for each mode, so drivers, transit users, pedestrians, cyclists, which allows for dissonance to be understood like within each specific mode context. And then within each model, individuals are classified into distinct dissonance categories. So I'll use the driving regression model as an example. Um, it will contain observations for only those whose primary mode is driving, and it can take the outcome of either you're a consonant driver or you're a dissonant driver who prefers to walk, a dissonant driver who prefers to cycle, or a dissonant driver who prefers to use transit. All right, now the findings. The overall dissonance rate in the study population is 17.4%. This is an estimate that represents just over 3.4 million Canadians in the study population, which is quite significant. Um, and mode-specific dissonance rates differ quite a lot. Nearly one-third of public transit users are dissonant. Pedestrians and drivers are considerably less dissonant at 19% and 14%, respectively. And cyclists are the least dissonant at 10%. Although in absolute terms, drivers do represent the largest share of dissonant people. Interestingly, when the four travel modes are grouped into a sustainable versus unsustainable binary, the dissonance rates are nearly identical between these two groups, so both at around 14%. But obviously, despite these rates being identical in absolute terms, there are 1.8 million dissonant drivers versus just under a million dissonant sustainable mode users in the study population. So, I mean, this is really promising. It suggests that the demand for sustainable travel is both very large and significantly larger than the desire to switch out of sustainable modes. And just a little side note, among dissonant drivers, the preferred mode alternatives are relatively evenly distributed between walking, transit, and cycling, with a little bit of a preference for walking above all. For some demographic facts, in terms of gender, dissonance actually didn't significantly differ between men and women at the aggregate. However, when you consider modality, women are significantly more dissonant when cycling or using public transit, and men are more dissonant when walking or driving. And also, the rate of dissonance is significantly higher for those who fall in the gender other category, and that's true across all modes. It's actually quite significantly higher. And in terms of age, there's a clear and significant relationship between consonants and age. So the older you are, the more likely you are to be consonant. Um, And income is very interesting, such that the lowest income group and the highest income group actually have significantly higher dissonance rates than medium income groups. Um, However, again, when considering modality, there are differences. Low-income pedestrians and cyclists are far more dissonant, and high-income drivers are significantly more dissonant than any other income group. And finally, when looking at urban form, we find that dissonance is highest in the active core, and that this largely stems from drivers in the active core being highly dissonant. Now on to the regression stuff. Firstly, looking at gender, um, compared to men, women are less likely to be dissonant when their primary mode is driving, but more likely when their primary mode is cycling. So this aligns well with the descriptive results, although the results are less conclusive for women who are pedestrians. But what I find particularly interesting is the pattern among the other gender category. Relative to men, this group is consistently more likely to be dissonant when public transit is the alternative mode. Income produces a far less intuitive result than I expected. Low-income household status is not consistently or significantly associated with the likelihood of being dissonant, with the exception of low-income pedestrians. That being said, perceived affordability does show meaningful associations with dissonance. Essentially, drivers who view sustainable modes as relatively more affordable than driving are generally more likely to be dissonant, even when the coefficients for low-income household status itself isn't significant. The findings related to, oh, I forgot that, missed that slide. The findings related to the built environment are also some of the more surprising results to come out of the analysis. Calculated accessibility measures were, broadly speaking, fairly weak predictors of dissonance across all modes. However, urban form did show a meaningful association with dissonance, um, but not in the way you would initially think. Living in suburban or exurban areas is associated with a significantly lower likelihood of being dissonant compared to living in the active core. And this holds true across nearly all modes, but the effects are most pronounced among drivers. And finally, for some of the most clear-cut relationships I found thus far, it's tied to travel perceptions. For current drivers, as I mentioned earlier, the relative perceived affordability of mode alternatives is significantly associated with dissonance. For current transit users, the relative perceived safety of mode alternatives is associated with higher levels of dissonance. For cyclists, somewhat surprisingly, safety is not associated with dissonance, but rather a perceived practicality of other modes. And finally, for pedestrians, the perceived time-saving potential of mode alternatives has a significant association with dissonance, which makes intuitive sense to me. Mhm. Okay. Yeah, so these results are broadly consistent with the existing literature on travel mode dissonance. The overall rate of 17.4% is somewhat comparable to the 21% found in Montreal, but certainly on the lower end of some of the studies out of Europe. Dissonance is also highest among public transit users and lowest among cyclists, which aligns with the prevailing literature, what the prevailing literature suggests about attitudes towards particular modes. Um, Overall, there are just under 1 million dissonant sustainable mode users in the study population, which of course points to a substantial challenge of retaining this usage over the long term. And descriptively, the particular concentrations of dissonance suggests that equity-deserving groups do disproportionately rely on sustainable modes out of necessity rather than preference. The relatively high prevalence of dissonance among low-income pedestrians and cyclists aligns with what we might expect under the conditions of transport poverty. However, the regression results do complicate this narrative a bit. with household income not producing super conclusive results uh, on that. At the same time, the prevalence of dissonance among women who cycle and use transit as their primary mode aligns with what we might expect, given what we know about gender mobility patterns. The regression results support this finding, at least for cycling. And there's also an indication that the other gender group exhibits patterns that are different from both men and women. They're consistently more likely to be dissonant when public transit is the alternative, which signals a form of public transit service inadequacies, particularly for this group. On the other hand, and more optimistic hand, the results point to an opportunity to promote switching to more sustainable modes. There are just over 1.8 million dissonant drivers in the study population, which is substantial and exciting. Descriptively, high-income drivers and male drivers tend to have relatively higher rates of dissonance. And while these patterns aren't as clear-cut in the regression models, particularly with regards to income, they of course do find that a lack of perceived affordability for drivers is associated with a greater likelihood of being dissonant. This finding, that perceived affordability is so important, um, really hones in the relative importance of travel perceptions throughout this project, and I think just in generally in studying dissonance and what we've seen from the other projects, I think it's really exciting that all of our perceptions variables are like producing really meaningful results on that front. And just a final note, I want to comment on the finding that among those who live in suburban and exurban regions, there's a particularly low likelihood of being dissonance compared to those in the active core. On the surface, this seems almost counterintuitive because in theory, these regions have fewer travel options, and fewer travel options should mean less of an ability to realize your mobility preferences. But this actually connects to a presentation I saw at the AAG earlier this year based on a not yet published paper, which essentially found that mode dissonance tends to become more prevalent the more travel options you have available to you. I think that finding that they had fits reasonably well with what I found. And this is an interesting avenue that I think I'm going to explore in some of the latter half of my thesis work. That's all I have for now. Thanks so much, and let me know if you have any questions.
Mackenzie, thank you so much for your presentation. So we have time for any question, reflections, or comments for Mackenzie. So, Mackenzie, could you please elaborate more if you observe any larger scale variations, geographic variations in dissonance based on your results so far?
Yeah, so I guess that I didn't talk about that. So on the city and like more provincial scale, I did find that larger cities did tend to have higher rates of dissonance, which kind of aligns with the findings that um, the urban core, the active core, had higher rates of dissonance. But I also found what was interesting is the prairie provinces. So cities in the prairie provinces had like um, high rates of car use and also very low rates of dissonance. So these weren't where the concentrations of dissonant drivers were living. But otherwise, like there weren't many trends when it comes to cities within Ontario or Quebec.
Interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chat
Mhm.
box.
Are there any other findings that you also found surprising or were not expecting to find? I'm sure there are, but I can't think of them on the top of my head. I really do think that the income finding is perplexing, especially because the descriptive results were so telling. Um, and so and the sample size was so big as well in the models. So that was just it still is kind of perplexing on why income wasn't a significant predictor of dissonance. So I would just say that. I know it's not new, but I am really perplexed by that. Um, where driving. um,
Oh, sorry. No, mine wasn't a question. I was just kind of
oh,
driving on what you were saying. But could you respond to Michael David?
yeah, to clarify for people do drive when they're not. So it's people that do drive. So current drivers are more likely to prefer to use other modes instead when they perceive those modes as more affordable. Um, yeah. Let's see how travel notion expression. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. Um, Sorry, I'm reading. It would be interesting to see how travel adaptation for low-income people ha impact the notion of dissonance, especially people living in suburban areas who over time might have adapted to their mobility condition and not reporting dissonance. Yeah, I think that is really interesting, and it does speak back to the fact that when you have more mobility options, hypothetically, you experience more dissonance. I think there is like a greater story here that the data can probably reveal. I just haven't worked on that yet.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.